Let me try to very briefly summarize what H.R. 5 does and why it's so problematic. The first thing to say is what H.R. 5 does is it modifies a very important historic piece of legislation. It modifies the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it takes federal legislation that Congress passed to combat racism, to outlaw discrimination on the basis of race, and it adds the phrase sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of protected classifications. So what this means is that if you believe we are created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other, you will now be the legal equivalent of a racist. That would be the functional and legal equivalent of a white supremacist belief, because that law bans discrimination on the basis of race, and now the Democrats want to ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, using that same legal mechanism, where they understand discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation to really be a disagreement about the nature of marriage, where they understand discrimination on the basis of gender identity to be a disagreement about human embodiment, about being created male and female. So this law would target Orthodox Jews, Roman Catholics, evangelical Christians, Latter-day Saints, Muslims, and any secular American who takes science or the natural law seriously. What this does is it says that if we disagree about these very controversial issues about human sexuality, if we disagree about gay marriage, if we disagree about transitioning, if we disagree about transgender identities, one side of that disagreement is now guilty of federal discrimination. So this isn't an actual bill about equality. Equality before law would say that if Bruce wants to be Caitlin, he's free to do that. What this law says is that everyone else needs to treat him as a woman. Everyone else needs to affirm him as a woman, allow him to go into female-only spaces. Businesses might have to pay for his transition therapy. Physicians might have to perform those therapies. So let me walk through 5 areas of concerns, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. First, there's severe privacy concerns here. If you say that gender identity is now a protected class in federal law, this means every single-sex facility in the country that's currently governed on biology, a single-sex facility for biological women, those spaces will now have to be opened up to biological men who identify as women. The reason that we have separate bathrooms and locker rooms for males and females, but thankfully we no longer have separate bathrooms for black and white, is that our skin color is irrelevant to what we do in the bathroom and the locker room. But our sexual differences as male and female is relevant. That's why we kept male and female restrooms when we thankfully got rid of segregated restrooms. The Equality Act turns this upside down. It says you can keep separate places for male and female, but you have to define male and female based on gender identity, not biology. So significant privacy concerns, which leads to the second area of concerns, which are safety concerns. Another reason that we have separate facilities, particularly for women, is because the vast majority of sex crimes are perpetrated by men, and the vast majority of victims are women. That's why women need safe spaces when they disrobe, when they undressed, when they're in homeless shelters. And I'll give an example here. There is an all-women's homeless shelter run by a Christian ministry in Anchorage, Alaska, which is currently being sued by a biological male who identifies as a woman, claiming that that Anchorage homeless shelter violated the city's gender identity law. So this would now be a federal law that would say battered women's shelters all across America have to allow men who identify as women into those shelters. So safety concerns. Third, equality concerns. I would imagine most of you are familiar with the headlines about transgender women, that is men who identify as women, setting world records in women's weightlifting, winning high school track championships. it violates equality when you say biological males can compete against girls and women if those biological males identify as girls and women. So equality concerns. Fourth, there are liberty concerns. What do I mean by the liberty concerns here? These are the sorts of laws that have been used to shut down Christian adoption agencies because they say it's discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation to say that a child deserves both a mother and a father. These are the laws that have been used to harass bakers and florists and photographers because they say it's discrimination not to bake a same-sex wedding cake. These are also the laws that are currently being used in 2 different states to sue Catholic hospitals because they don't perform sex reassignment procedures. And they claim it's discrimination not to remove the healthy uterus from the healthy body of a healthy woman who identifies as a man. Again, this is a disagreement. We disagree about gay marriage. We disagree about whether sex reassignment medicine is good medicine. And this law would make it a federal civil rights violation to believe what Orthodox Jews and Roman Catholics and evangelicals and Muslims and Mormons and other people have believed for the past 2,000 years. And then lastly, there are ideology concerns. And what I mean here is that this will be placing the full force of the federal government behind a certain sexual ideology. This isn't racial equality, what the Civil Rights Act was originally intended to do. This is now saying that there's a certain viewpoint about human sexuality and the human body, that we could be trapped in the wrong body, that gender is a spectrum, that sex is merely assigned at birth, that sex can be reassigned later in life. These are all ideological viewpoints, and it enshrines those viewpoints in federal civil rights law. It will be mandated to be taught in schools as part of efforts of remedying historic forms of discrimination to overcome those. So your children and your grandchildren will be indoctrinated in school to believe a certain sexual ideology. And there really will be no religious liberty protections, because one of the things that H.R. 5 does is it explicitly says that the Religious Liberty Restoration Act, or RFRA, cannot be used as a defense against the Equality Act. It explicitly says that RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, does not apply to the Equality Act. And then the last thing I'll add here is that it redefines what constitutes a public accommodation beyond the legal definition in the 1964 law to more or less govern every business, every private entity in the United States. This could reach private schools as places of public accommodations. This could reach churches when they're not engaged in worship, so like the church hall, the church basement. This will reach most all businesses. It explicitly says it applies to medical institutions and it applies to funeral homes. This is a very expansive piece of government regulation, which will be regulating more or less every aspect of our lives. To say that what we believe is true is actually now a civil rights crime. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to Derek, and we can do some Q&A.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate that. That is amazing. Unfortunately, I'm going to say amazing, just the level that this bill goes to. One question that's here is, would the Senate actually vote to pass H.R. 5? If not, and if Trump would do you think, if they actually did, would Trump veto this?
Great question. So I think a lot depends on what the vote looks like later this week in the House. The Senate Majority Leader shouldn't bring this to the floor of the Senate for a vote. But the Senate Majority Leader should say that this is bad legislation for the country and the Senate's not even going to consider it. So no matter what the House does, it's dying in the Senate. But no one knows what Leader McConnell will do on this. I don't believe he has said anything publicly as to what he will do on this. And I imagine that a bad vote in the House might influence him in a bad direction. So what we want is we want to have as good of a vote in the House as possible. But then regardless of what happens in the House, the Senate should not move on this legislation because this legislation is bad for the American people. If it were to reach the president's desk, the president should veto it, again, because this is bad legislation for the American people. I wrote a piece for the Daily Signal last week pointing out 7 different ways in which this bill from the Democrats would undo important achievements of the Trump administration. I think, by and large, the Trump administration has been a mixed bag, some good, some bad. But one area where they have been good, they've been good on unborn human life, they've been good on religious liberty, and they've been good on gender ideology. They undid all of the bad things that the Obama administration did on religious liberty, that the Obama administration did on abortion, that the Obama administration did on transgender ideology. And all of those things would come back if H.R. 5 becomes law. So I think that both McConnell and Trump should be opposed to this.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. I'm going to say this word really quick. If you have a question and you want to ask us that question, it's 202-823-0874, 202-823-0874. Next question, Ryan, is would this put Title IX at jeopardy?
Well, what it would do is it would in effect modify the way in which Title IX is understood by the courts and how it is implemented. Title IX says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex when it comes to education. That means that you need to give women and girls equal educational opportunity as boys and men and equal athletic opportunities. What this would do is say, but that word sex now means gender identity. Women and girls aren't biological categories, they are social identities. And so anyone who identifies as a woman or a girl now would have access to educational initiatives meant to empower women and girls, to athletic opportunities meant to empower women and girls, to bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams meant for women and girls. So what it would do in effect is it would be the unraveling of all of those Title IX protections, which were meant to protect women and girls, by now allowing boys and men who identify as women and girls to take advantage of all of those programs.
Wow. That is something. If you have your phone, if you're on this line, I'm going to challenge you to put it on mute. I just didn't want to do the broad one just to make sure I don't mess up Ryan. The other question I had was, Ryan, and I can almost answer this myself, but what does RFRA stand for?
Sure. It stands for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And let me just say a few words about this. This is a law that was passed in 1993. It was passed unanimously in the House of Representatives. It was passed with 97 votes in the Senate. Representative Chuck Schumer and Senator Ted Kennedy were the lead sponsors on this. And President Bill Clinton signed it into law. So this was something that back in the 90s, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, secular people and religious people could all agree that religious freedom was a good thing, and they could pass legislation bipartisanly. Clinton could sign it into law. Everyone could agree about this for 20 years. And then Hobby Lobby happened. The Little Sisters of the Poor happened. And the baker, the florist, and the photographer happened. And all of a sudden, religious liberty became a partisan issue because the left was violating religious liberty, and it was conservative Christians who were being protected because their beliefs were being violated by the federal government. And all of a sudden, wait, we don't actually want to protect those people. So it's hugely problematic now that religious liberty has been made into a partisan issue. This is a human rights issue. This is something that all of us, wherever we fall on the political spectrum, should be able to say, you should have the right to practice your faith as you understand your faith, provided that you don't violate other people's rights. And the owners of Hobby Lobby weren't violating anyone's rights. The Little Sisters of the Poor weren't violating anyone's rights. The baker, the florist, the photographer, they're not violating people's rights. And what's going to happen with H.R. 5 is they're going to say, you have to support same-sex marriage, you have to support transgender identities, or else you're now violating the Civil Rights Act, and you wouldn't have any religious liberty protections.
Got it. Sorry about that interruption. You got it. That's great. That's excellent. And so what you're saying, Ryan, is that this changes the terms from sex to gender identity. And so I think it's important for everybody to understand. One question that we had was, who authored the bill, and then who are the people currently in Congress standing with Pelosi on the bill?
Yes, so we don't know exactly who behind the scenes was working on this legislation, but it's probably a variety of left-leaning special interest groups, the Human Rights Campaign, the ACLU. It's been introduced by some of the more progressive members of Congress, and it has several hundred Democratic supporters, people who have either explicitly become a co-sponsor of the bill or who have announced their support for the bill. It looks like it'll be voted on later this week on the House floor. It looks like it'll be a pretty party line vote. There will probably be a small handful of Democrats who do not vote for the bill, and there will probably be a small handful of Republicans who do vote for the bill. But then otherwise, the two respective caucuses will vote on a party line basis, which again is really unfortunate because we shouldn't be enshrining a sexual ideology into our federal law, and we certainly shouldn't be messing with a landmark piece of legislation like the Civil Rights Act of '64 as the vehicle for enshrining sexual ideology in the law. It almost kind of desecrates what a signal achievement the Civil Rights Act is to now put transgenderism and gay marriage into that piece of legislation.
Oh, that's great. That's very helpful. I think there's been a lot of problematic aspects of this bill to date, and I appreciate you clarifying that. Especially, I love what you're saying about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is a monumental piece of legislation, and they are, for lack of better terms, tweaking with this piece of legislation to then change the terminology and the definitions within that, and which makes this an incredibly problematic piece of legislation. So, that being said, of course, we have a lot of different things that can do, and we're going to address a little bit of this one answer shortly, because we have a question that's actually asked, what can the church do to help get the word out? How can we help communicate our concerns to the Senate and to the President? We'll talk about that in just a moment, but off the cuff, Ryan, do you have any additional items that you want to share, maybe regarding that or even this piece of legislation? Because I think where people are, they're questioning about, the religious liberty aspect. Sometimes things are put into a bucket and, on one side of the aisle or the other, but I appreciate you just clarifying that this isn't a bucket issue. This is a real human rights issue that we should all be standing for, correct?
Yeah, that is exactly right. This is a human rights issue because it's a human nature issue. This really questions, how do we understand the human person? How do we understand that being made in the image and likeness of God? And so I have two thoughts here in terms of, what we all can do to help here, what the church can do. And thought number one is to explain how sexual orientation and gender identity are not just like race. You sometimes hear the phrase, gay is the new black, or trans is the new black, and they want to kind of hijack the civil rights movement and attach LGBTQ causes to the civil rights movement. One very important thing here, and I think Ryan Baumberger has done a really good job on this in some of his public speaking. I was at one of the Supreme Court rallies there, and I heard him speak on this point. He did a great job. But just explaining all of the historical, sociological, theological, and philosophical differences between being a black American and being an LGBT American. Having skin of a certain color versus acting in a certain way sexually or identifying a certain way when it comes to your gender. I think it's really important for people to understand that distinction and to not allow the activists on the left to just kind of hijack the civil rights movement for their own sexual agenda. And then the second thing is going to be, at the end of the day, all of us have the job of bearing witness to the truth. And increasingly, our culture thinks that the truth about our embodiment as male and female, the truth about human sexuality, is a form of discrimination. It's a form of bigotry. They think that if you are against gay marriage, you're just as evil and wicked as the racists who were against interracial marriage. We need to explain why the racists were wicked. What they believed got human nature wrong, because it got that creature made in the image and likeness of God wrong. But that so too, what we believe about marriage and sex gets human nature right. And it's the activists here who are getting human nature wrong. The activists who are giving teenage girls double mastectomies and testosterone, they're the ones getting human nature wrong. And so we all need to do what we can to promote the truth about the human person, the human body, the image and likeness of God. And this is going to be an intergenerational struggle. This isn't just about defeating a bill that's pending before the Congress, this week. This isn't just about, the next election cycle. This is something that I'm going to be working on for the rest of my life. It's something that my children and probably my grandchildren, the most recent heresy that the church is witnessing. You can think about like the early church heresies. You can think about the Reformation, Counter-Reformation debates. Today's debates are about the nature of the human person. It started with abortion. It continued with same-sex marriage, and now it's extending into transgenderism. And that's a 50-year progression I just talked about. I think about when Roe v. Wade happened. Think about when the abortion juggernaut started, and then gay marriage, and then transgenderism. We as a church need to be responding to this, and it's going to take several generations to fully respond.
Brian, do you feel like, and I know you got to go, but do you feel like this is really the ultimate, I won't say the ultimate attack on God, but do you feel like this is about an attack of kind of taking the God factor out of human society completely?
This is part of that secularism agenda that you just described, but I also think this is part of rejecting the idea of creation. If God is the creator and we are creatures, we are creation, then there's a certain meaning to creation, right? If nature has an author, there's a natural law. The alternative is that we are our own creators. We're self-creators, so that nature is malleable and we can recreate ourselves, right? We can change genders, change sexes. There's really what's at stake here is whether or not there is a creator, and who is that creator? Is it you? Is it me? Or is it God?